South Africa is honestly one of the most interesting countries in Africa. It's got massive cities, tons of natural resources, a strong financial sector, stunning landscape, and one of the biggest economies on the continent. But it also has some serious issues. High unemployment, huge inequality, power cuts, political corruption, crime, and an economy that hasn't grown as fast as many people expected. So, how did they get here? How did a country go from one of the world's most infamous systems of racial segregation to electing Nelson Mandela as its first black president, and then eventually finding itself dealing with another major crisis? This is the story of South Africa. To really understand modern South Africa, we need to go back a bit to when European settlement started in the Cape in the 1600s, when the Dutch set up settlement that later became Cape Town. Over the next few centuries, the region became more and more divided between groups, including indigenous African communities, European settlers, and people brought in from other parts of the world. Eventually, the British took control of the Cape, and this led to conflicts between the British and the Dutch-speaking settlers known as the Boers. In the end, the British and the Boer territories were brought together into one country, that is, the Union of South Africa, created in 1910. But political power was mostly in the hands of the white minority, and racial segregation was already deeply rooted. Then, in 1948, things changed in a much more structured way. In 1948, the National Party won South Africa's election. The new government introduced a new system called Apartheid. The word literally means apartness, and basically, that was the whole idea. The government classified people by race and created laws that controlled where different racial groups could live, work, study, and travel. Black South Africans were especially restricted. Separate residential areas were created, pass laws controlled movement, and political rights were very limited. Even families could be split up based on racial classification. And while the white minority was made up of a much smaller share of the population, it held most of the political and economic power. For millions of South Africans, this wasn't just discrimination. It was how everyday life was legally structured. But people didn't accept it. They pushed back. One of the main groups fighting apartheid was the African National Congress, or ANC. One of its most well-known members was Nelson Mandela. Mandela originally supported peaceful resistance, but as the government became more violent towards opposition, things escalated. In 1960, police opened fire on protesters in Sharpeville, killing dozens of people. The massacre became a global symbol of apartheid's brutality. The government responded by banning major opposition groups. Mandela was eventually arrested and sentenced to life in prison. He would spend 27 years behind bars, but his imprisonment didn't end the resistance. If anything, it made him even more famous around the world. International pressure on South Africa increased, countries imposed sanctions, companies pulled out, and inside the country, protests kept on going. One of the most famous moments came in 1976 when students in Soweto protested against the government's education policies. The uprising was violently crushed. Images of it spread worldwide. South Africa was becoming more and more isolated, but the government still wasn't ready to step down. By the late 1980s, South Africa was under serious pressure. The economy was struggling, sanctions were biting, resistance inside the country was growing, and apartheid was getting harder and harder to maintain. Then came a turning point. In 1990, President de Klerk announced that political groups like the ANC would be unbanned, and then came the moment the world had been waiting for. After 27 years, Nelson Mandela walked out of prison, but South Africa still had a major challenge ahead of them. The country had to transition from apartheid to democracy without falling into a full-scale civil war. Negotiations began. There were disagreements, there was violence, but eventually, leaders reached an agreement. And in 1924, South Africa held its first democratic elections where all races could vote. The ANC won, and Nelson Mandela became the president. For millions of people, it was a historic moment. A system that once seemed unbreakable finally ended. Mandela's presidency wasn't just about running a government. It was also about keeping the country from falling apart. Instead of pushing revenge against the old system, Mandela focused on reconciliation. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission looked into human rights abuses from the Apartheid era. Victims were able to share their stories, and perpetrators could apply for amnesty under certain conditions. The idea was to face the past without triggering another cycle of violence. But political reconciliation didn't automatically fix the economy. Apartheid had created massive gaps in wealth, education, housing, and jobs, and those gaps didn't disappear in 1994. South Africa was now a democracy, but it was still extremely unequal. Mandela then stepped down in 1999, and the country moved into a new phase. For much of the 2000s, South Africa kept developing economically, but deeper problems were starting to build. Then, Jacob Zuma came into power. Zuma became the president in 2009. His time in office became strongly linked to corruption allegations and something called state capture. State capture is basically when powerful private interests are accused of influencing government institutions and state-owned companies for their own benefits. The controversy became huge. South Africa's state-owned electric company, Eskom, became a symbol of the country's struggles. Years of financial problems, poor management, corruption allegations, and underinvestment led to serious electrical shortages. And that brings us to one of South Africa's biggest modern issues. Imagine running a business, then suddenly the power goes out, then it comes back again, then it goes out. For South Africans, this became known as load shedding. And it wasn't just inconvenient, it affected businesses, factories, schools, hospitals, transport, and everyday life. It also slowed down economic growth. South Africa used to be one of Africa's major industrial powers, but now businesses had to work around an unreliable power supply. And electricity wasn't the only issue. South Africa has huge economic potential. It has minerals like gold, platinum, and coal. It has agricultural land. It has large cities like Johannesburg and Cape Town. It has the largest consumer market in Africa with a developed financial sector. So, why are people still struggling? Well, one big issue is unemployment. Another is inequality. South Africa is still one of the most unequal countries in the world. There is a massive gap between wealthy areas with modern infrastructure and communities where people struggle to find work and basic needs. And this is where history really matters, because this inequality didn't just appear overnight. Decades of apartheid created unequal access to land, education, jobs, and opportunity. But history isn't the whole story. Governance issues, corruption, weak growth, infrastructure failures, and political decisions have also played a big role. So, South Africa's problems don't come from just one cause. They're the result of decades of issues stacking over time. Today, South Africa is still one of the most important countries in Africa. It has a large economy, a strong financial sector, major cities, huge natural resources, and remains an important political and diplomatic player on the continent. But the country is at a crossroads. The government needs to fix the infrastructure, create more jobs, tackle corruption, improve public services, and somehow reduce the massive inequality that still exists. At the same time, South Africa has something many countries facing similar situations don't have: a strong democracy and institutions that can still push for change. So, the future is still wide open. South Africa's story isn't just a story of failure, it's a story of transformation. In less than a century, the country went from a system where racial segregation was enforced by law to becoming a multiracial democracy. Nelson Mandela became the global symbol of reconciliation. But political freedom didn't instantly erase decades of economic inequality, and democracy didn't automatically fix corruption, unemployment, infrastructure issues, or slow growth. South Africa defeated apartheid, but it also learned that ending a political system was only the beginning. The much harder task was rebuilding the country that system left behind. And today, South Africa is still facing the big question: can it turn its huge potential into real prosperity for the people who live there? Well, only time will tell. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.